The Last of Us Part 2. A deep dive into its reception. It released in June 2020 by Naughty Dog, stands as one of the most ambitious and polarizing games of the modern era. As a sequel to the universally acclaimed The Last of Us, expectations were astronomical. The original game set a benchmark for storytelling in video games, with its emotionally resonant narrative, complex characters, and cinematic quality. Given this backdrop, The Last of Us Part 2 was anticipated to follow in its predecessor's footsteps. However, what transpired upon its release was a whirlwind of acclaim, controversy, and intense discussion that continues to reverberate through the gaming community. To fully appreciate why The Last of Us Part 2 was both lauded and reviled, and why its reception has evolved over time, we need to delve into the narrative structure, thematic depth, character arcs, gameplay innovations, and the broader cultural context in which it was released. The strengths of The Last of Us Part 2. 1. Narrative ambition and subversion of expectations. One of the most striking aspects of The Last of Us Part 2 is its narrative boldness. From the outset, Naughty Dog makes it clear that this is not a conventional sequel. Where the first game delivered a heart-wrenching but relatively straightforward story of survival and love in a post-apocalyptic world, the sequel takes a much darker and more complex path. Subversion of expectations. The game opens with a brutal and shocking event: the death of Joel, one of the most beloved characters in gaming history, at the hands of a new character, Abby. This event serves as the narrative catalyst for the entire game, flipping the player's expectations on their head. By killing off the protagonist of the first game within the opening hours, the developers make a bold statement: this is not a story about heroes and villains, but about the cyclical nature of violence and the consequences of vengeance. Dual narrative structure. The game's structure is another key element of its narrative ambition. After spending several hours guiding Ellie on her quest for revenge, players are suddenly thrust into the shoes of Abby, the very character they've been conditioned to hate. This dual perspective forces players to confront the moral ambiguity of the story, challenging them to empathize with both sides of the conflict. By the time the two storylines converge, players are left questioning their own assumptions and the nature of revenge. 2. Thematic depth. Exploration of revenge and its consequences. At its core, The Last of Us Part 2 is a meditation on revenge and its destructive consequences. Ellie's journey is one of escalating brutality, as her single-minded pursuit of Abby leads her further into darkness. The game does not shy away from depicting the toll this takes on Ellie, both physically and emotionally. By the end of the game, Ellie's quest for vengeance has cost her everything: her friends, her surrogate family, and even her sense of self. This theme is mirrored in Abby's story, as she too grapples with the consequences of her actions and the cycle of violence she is caught in. Moral ambiguity. One of the game's most divisive elements is its refusal to offer clear moral answers. Unlike the first game, which presented Joel's decision to save Ellie as morally complex but ultimately understandable, the sequel constantly forces players to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Is Ellie's quest for revenge justified? Can Abby be redeemed? By placing players in control of both characters, the game blurs the lines between right and wrong, asking players to empathize with characters they may not want to. The cycle of violence. A recurring theme throughout the game is the idea of the cycle of violence, how one act of violence begets another, leading to an endless loop of pain and suffering. This theme is reinforced through the gameplay, as players are constantly reminded of the consequences of their actions. Every enemy killed has a name, and their comrades react with grief and anger. This serves to humanize the game's antagonists and underscore the futility of the violence that drives the story. 3. Character development. Ellie's descent. The Ellie of The Last of Us Part 2 is a far cry from the hopeful, determined girl we knew in the first game. Consumed by anger and grief, she embarks on a path of revenge that slowly erodes her humanity. Her journey is heartbreaking to watch, as she becomes increasingly isolated and consumed by her quest. By the end of the game, Ellie is a broken person, having lost everything she once held dear. Her decision to let Abby go in the final confrontation is both a moment of catharsis and a tragic realization of the cost of her actions. Abby's redemption arc. Abby, initially introduced as the antagonist, undergoes one of the most compelling character arcs in the game. Her motivations are understandable. She seeks revenge for the death of her father at Joel's hands, but as the game progresses, we see her grow beyond this desire for vengeance. Through her interactions with Lev and Yara, she begins to question her own actions and seeks redemption. By the end of the game, Abby is no longer the cold, ruthless soldier we first met, but someone who has found a new purpose and a chance at a new life. Secondary characters. The game also does an excellent job of developing its secondary characters. Dina, Ellie's girlfriend, is a well-rounded character with her own motivations and struggles. Her relationship with Ellie is one of the few sources of warmth in the game, but it is also strained by Ellie's obsession with revenge. Similarly, characters like Jesse, Tommy, and Lev add depth to the story and serve as mirrors to the main character's struggles. 4. Gameplay innovations. Enhanced combat and stealth mechanics. The Last of Us Part 2 builds on the gameplay foundations of the first game, introducing more fluid and dynamic combat and stealth mechanics. The game's environments are more open and vertical, allowing for greater player freedom in how they approach encounters. The AI is also significantly improved, making enemies more challenging and reactive. This, combined with the game's emphasis on resource scarcity, creates a tense and immersive experience. Emotional impact of gameplay. The gameplay is designed to reinforce the game's themes and narrative. The brutality of the combat, the desperation of the stealth sequences, and the moments of quiet exploration all serve to immerse players in the game's world and story. The developers also make use of gameplay to heighten the emotional impact of key moments. For example, the final confrontation between Ellie and Abby is a brutal, visceral fight that is difficult to play through, mirroring the character's emotional states and the stakes of the encounter. 5. Technical mastery. Visuals and animation. Technically, The Last of Us Part 2 is a stunning achievement. The game's visuals are among the best of its generation, with meticulously detailed environments, lifelike character models, and incredibly realistic animations. The attention to detail is astounding, from the way characters' faces convey emotion to the way the world changes over time as the story progresses. The game's use of motion capture is also groundbreaking, allowing for nuanced and subtle performances from the actors. Sound design and music. The game's sound design is equally impressive, with a richly detailed soundscape that enhances the atmosphere and tension. Gustavo Santaolalla's score is haunting and evocative, perfectly complementing the game's tone and themes. The use of music in key moments is particularly effective, adding emotional weight to the story. The initial backlash and controversy. Despite the game's many strengths, The Last of Us Part 2 faced significant backlash upon its release. The reasons for this are multifaceted and stem from a combination of narrative decisions, player expectations, and broader cultural factors. 1. The death of Joel. Shock and betrayal. The death of Joel early in the game was a shock to many players. Joel was the heart of the first game, and his relationship with Ellie was central to its emotional impact. Many players felt a deep attachment to Joel and were upset by the brutal and seemingly senseless way he was killed. This was compounded by the fact that players were then asked to play as Abby, the character responsible for his death. For many, this felt like a betrayal of the first game's legacy. Subversion of player expectations. Joel's death and the subsequent shift in perspective to Abby were seen by some as a deliberate attempt by the developers to subvert player expectations. While this narrative choice was praised by some for its boldness, others felt that it undermined their emotional investment in the story and characters. This led to a sense of alienation and resentment among a segment of the player base. 2. Character arcs and representation. Ellie's transformation. Ellie's descent into darkness and the loss of her humanity was difficult for many players to accept. The Ellie of The Last of Us Part 2 is a much darker and more complex character than in the first game, and some players struggled with the direction her character was taken. Her actions, particularly towards the end of the game, were seen by some as inconsistent with the Ellie they knew and loved. Representation and diversity. The game also sparked controversy over its representation of LGBTQ characters and its handling of themes related to gender identity. While some praised the game for its inclusivity and portrayal of complex, diverse characters, others criticized it for what they perceived as forced representation. The inclusion of a transgender character, Lev, and the depiction of a lesbian relationship between Ellie and Dina were points of contention for some players, leading to a broader discussion about representation in gaming. 3. The nature of the story. Darkness and Nihilism: The Last of Us Part 2 is an incredibly dark and often bleak game. Its story is unrelenting in its depiction of violence, loss, and the toll of revenge. This was a significant departure from the first game, which, despite its dark themes, offered moments of hope and human connection. Some players found the sequel's tone to be too depressing and nihilistic and felt that it lacked the emotional balance of the original. Player agency and narrative control. Another point of contention was the perceived lack of player agency in the story. The Last of Us Part 2 is a heavily narrative-driven game, with the developers maintaining strict control over the story and its outcome. While this approach allows for a tightly crafted narrative experience, it also limits player choice, which was frustrating for some players who wanted more control over the direction of the story. 4. Leaks and misinformation. The impact of leaks. The controversy surrounding the game was exacerbated by the fact that key story details were leaked online before the game's release. These leaks included major plot points, such as Joel's death and the role of Abby in the story. The leaks led to a wave of misinformation and negative sentiment before the game had even been released. Many players formed opinions based on incomplete or misleading information, which contributed to the backlash. The evolution of reception. Why more people appreciate the game now. Over time, the reception of The Last of Us Part 2 has become more positive. This shift can be attributed to several factors. 1. Time and reflection. Distance from initial shock. With time, many players have been able to distance themselves from the initial shock and emotional response to the game. This has allowed for a more measured and nuanced appreciation of the game's themes and narrative choices. Players who were initially put off by the game's bold storytelling have come to recognize the depth and complexity of its narrative. Re-evaluation of themes. As players have revisited the game and engaged in discussions with others, there has been a greater appreciation for the thematic depth of the story. The exploration of revenge, the cycle of violence, and the consequences of one's actions have resonated with players on a deeper level, leading to a re-evaluation of the game's narrative choices. 2. Cultural shifts and representation. Growing acceptance of diversity. The gaming community has seen a shift in attitudes towards representation and diversity in recent years. As the conversation around LGBTQ representation in media has evolved, more players have come to appreciate the game's inclusive approach. The portrayal of Ellie and Dina's relationship, as well as Lev's story, has been recognized as a significant step forward for representation in gaming. Broader conversations about storytelling in games. The discourse around storytelling in games has also evolved, with more players recognizing the value of complex, challenging narratives. The Last of Us Part 2 has been praised for pushing the boundaries of what a video game narrative can be and for challenging players to think critically about the story and characters. 3. Critical analysis and retrospective reviews. Influence of critics and scholars. As more critics, scholars, and content creators have analyzed the game in depth, there has been a growing appreciation for its artistic and narrative achievements. Essays, video analyses, and retrospective reviews have highlighted the game's strengths, leading to a more positive perception among the gaming community. Reassessment of controversial elements. Some of the game's more controversial elements, such as the death of Joel and the portrayal of Abby, have been reassessed in a more positive light. Critics have argued that these choices were necessary for the story the developers wanted to tell, and that they added layers of complexity and depth to the narrative. 4. The passage of time, legacy, and influence. As the dust has settled, The Last of Us Part 2 has solidified its place as a landmark game in the medium. Its influence can be seen in the way other games approach narrative and character development. The game's legacy is one of pushing boundaries and challenging conventions, and this has been increasingly recognized by the gaming community. Continued discussion and engagement. The ongoing discussion and engagement with the game have kept it relevant and have allowed for a more balanced perspective to emerge. As more players have taken the time to reflect on the game, the initial backlash has given way to a more nuanced understanding of its strengths and weaknesses. Conclusion. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that dared to take risks, challenge player expectations, and tell a story that is both deeply personal and thematically resonant. Its narrative ambition, thematic depth, character development, and technical mastery are undeniable. However, these same qualities also made it a target for controversy and backlash, particularly in the immediate aftermath of its release. Over time, however, the gaming community's perception of the game has evolved. While it may never achieve the universal acclaim of its predecessor, The Last of Us Part 2 has earned a place as one of the most important and influential games of its generation. It is a game that will continue to be discussed, analyzed, and debated for years to come, and its legacy will be defined by its willingness to take bold creative risks